David Goggins was born on February 17th, 1975 in Buffalo, New York by Trunis and Jackie Goggins. He was born and raised in Buffalo up to, I believe, the age of 6 or 7. And at a very young age, he had a rough childhood. In his book, Can't Hurt Me, which is where I'm taking most of this information from, and between that and other things online and reading about him and things along those lines, he even says in his own book that he should have been a statistic between everything he's been through in his life. He shouldn't have ended up where he is. Between his childhood and his upbringing, he was raised by a very abusive father, both physically and mentally in several ways, and at a very young age had to work late nights at his father's skate rink and work there at 5 years old, 6 years old, working till 3, 4 in the morning, and then still having to go to school and try to live and uphold a fairly normal life and kind of keep to the neighborhood, not hierarchy, but keep up to standards of appealing and looking like a normal family. But on the inside, they were dealing with an abusive and psychotic father that was losing his mind and running underground drug smuggling businesses and maybe it wasn't just drug smuggling, but dirty businesses and making a lot of money underground and trying to live the American dream, but falsely. David Goggins' father was so bad that he talks about several stories in the book about how his father had treated him and his mother, where they had cops called and the police didn't believe his mother was being abused, or they didn't do anything about it because his dad was a smooth talker and put on a good face and was a compulsive liar. But not only that, he talks about one situation where he was riding his bike and his father was at home and he told him not to go on the road, and he was riding his bike down the sidewalk, turned around in someone's driveway, and his front tire barely glanced and touched the pavement on the road. And when he came back inside, his father yelled at him and told him to go upstairs. And let's just say he received punishment, I guess is the easiest way to say it. But he talks about how he was around his father with other women, and his dad pulled a gun on him one time because his father was so paranoid with some of the dirty business he was up against and dealing with stuff mentally and on drugs and dealing with all this stuff, that eventually his mother had enough of it and committed to a plan to basically escape and move back to Indiana, where she was originally from. Some of this is something that me and Noah had already kind of discussed earlier in a few podcasts ago, where he ended up moving to Brazil, Indiana, and started going to school there. And in the book, he talks about how life was better, but it still was not easy because his mother struggled to pay bills. I believe they lived with his grandparents for a short amount of time trying to get on their feet. And not only that, but with everything he had dealt with, David was not necessarily an outstanding student when it came to academics and grades. So he had struggled to get through kindergarten, or not kindergarten, but second grade, third grade, and he had certain teachers where there was one teacher that actually helped him move along and do well in school, but he noticed that he had to work harder than everybody else at a young age and struggled. And then once he got through that class, other teachers were not so caring and helpful. So he struggled through high school, but at one point became a very, very good basketball player. And at one point his mother ended up in another relationship and was actually engaged and were planning on getting married. And the amount of traumatic experiences he had seen as a child, is absolutely ridiculous, because in that situation, which Noah and me I think talked about a few podcasts ago, his what would have been future stepfather actually got murdered. He lived in India at the time, went home, and someone had snuck into his garage when he wasn't looking and shot him and killed him. And he doesn't talk about if they ever figured out why or what was going on with that or why he was killed. But that was something that kind of broke his mother even more, considering the stuff she dealt with between his father and it was the one chance that it seemed like David's mom had a turnaround, and it didn't help his situation. But not only that, when he was in 8th grade, he talks about another traumatic experience where he basically had witnessed a small boy get ran over by a school bus, which in itself is absolutely insane that would happen to anybody. But he talks about in the audiobook, and with the reader to the audiobook, they discuss how they fact checked all their information and spent plenty of time doing this, that there are articles of this happening, and that I think this would have been in the mid 80s down in Brazil, Indiana. So I have not looked at these newspapers myself, but the amount of things that he had witnessed as a child and the stuff he was dealing with, it once we get later into his life and some of the accomplishments he's had and the stuff he's pushed through, like he says, he shouldn't be where he is and done as well as he did, considering his bringing up and everything he dealt with. And sadly, another struggle he had throughout schooling wasn't only academic, but also racial issues. At the time, Brazil, Indiana wasn't necessarily the most racially accepting towns. And he talks about how a few towns over, they still held KKK meetings and stuff like that nearby. And he dealt with that in a small town school where I'm pretty sure he accounts for being the only African American in his class, if not possibly the entire school. So that's another setback that he had to deal with personally, working through school and dealing with people just not listening to what exactly he's doing. He talks about how he had death threats on his truck and stuff on his locker and nooses hung in his locker and a bunch of crazy stuff, and how he had to talk to the principal about it. But the principal knew all this was happening, but there was nothing he could do, considering, or there wasn't anything he did do, considering it was only happening to one student, which sadly is a terrible reality that he had to deal with for years. And he dealt with it and worked through it and got through it. He barely graduated, but when he was in high school, he was an amazing varsity basketball player, and he actually got kicked because he didn't want to put up with his coach's training regiments. But he ended up becoming one of the best defensive players on the team, and I think was one of the best players in Indiana when he was in high school at the time.